Using the proper frame rate is a creative choice that can really take your videos to the next level. So in this video, I'm going to tell you what frame rates are, and hopefully you can use this as a guide moving forward with your videography journey. And that way you can always have this to come back to, whether you're a beginner or you're more advanced. So let's get started. So what are frame rates? Well, frame rates are just the number of images or the number of frames across 1 second of time. So you'll hear 24 frames per second. That means there's 24 frames within a second. Or there is 60 frames per second, which is 60 frames or 60 images in a 1 second period. And what that's doing is the camera's taking in that information as you're shooting your video. But why does that matter? Well, depending on which one you choose, it's gonna make your videos look more lifelike or make your videos look more digital. But it's not enough to just say that they all look different. Like, how can I use them in real life? Well, Hollywood movies typically use 24 frames per second because it's the closest thing to what we see in real life. Television broadcasting and news broadcasting typically uses 30 frames per second. And then you have 60, 120 frames per second, and there's even higher ones than that. But anything really 60 frames per second and higher is typically used for slow motion. If you're going for that cinematic movie look, I want you to remember to always shoot your videos with the intent of converting them to 24 frames per second in the edit. So essentially what that means is that anytime you shoot higher than 24 frames per second, like 60 frames per second or 120 frames per second, what you're gonna do is you're gonna put that in your editing software, you're gonna convert that to 24 frames per second, and it's gonna make it much slower. So the higher that number, the more slower the footage is going to be. And then whenever you put it onto your timeline, it's gonna play back smoothly. If you don't convert your footage to 24 frames per second first, when you put it on the timeline, it's gonna play back all choppy and it's not gonna look good at all. When I'm out shooting, I'm very intentional with the frame rate that I'm using because the frame rate that I choose is a creative choice that helps me tell the story the way that I want to tell it. If I shoot all of my shots in slow motion, I know that that's gonna get dull and very boring really quick. So I'm not shooting everything in slow motion. I'm only picking the frame rate that's gonna help best tell the story. Some shots I'll shoot in 24 frames per second, like if I'm shooting some dialogue or like an interview or something like that, or if I want to just capture something that needs to be in what it would be seen at in real life. But I'll also get some shots at 60 frames per second or 120 frames per second. And those slow-mo shots are typically ones that I want to draw a lot of attention to because they're either things that are really important or things that capture details that you wouldn't be able to see unless you actually shot them in slow motion. So you can shoot at 24, 30, 60, or 120 frames per second. But even if you shoot at those frame rates, you can still mess up your footage. And the reason why is because there's something called the 180-degree shutter rule. And basically what that means is that your shutter should be double what your frame rate is. So if you're shooting at 24 frames per second, you want to be shooting at 1/50 shutter speed. If you're shooting at too high of a shutter speed, you'll notice that you're not getting natural motion blur in your shot. So always make sure that your shutter speed is double what your frame rate is so that you can get that natural motion blur. But that creates an issue. So if I'm shooting at 24 frames per second and my shutter speed is 1/50 and I'm shooting outside in the middle of the day, I'm probably gonna have this blown out looking shot. So what do I do? When you're shooting outside during bright daylight, it can be impossible to get proper exposure when trying to shoot at 24 frames per second. So for that, what I use is this Haida filter here. And so basically this is like sunglasses for your camera. So this thing, what I do is I'll take it and I'll screw it on to the front of my lens. I really like this Haida filter here because it's a variable ND filter, so I can quickly make adjustments to the exposure that way. And it's also a circular polarizer, so it's gonna cut out any reflections if I'm doing any shots with like cars or anything like that. Then I'll go back to the camera, make sure that my settings are all correct, and then I'll adjust the filter to make sure I have the proper exposure. So if I move that little dial, you can see as I move it to the left, it's starting to get that proper exposure. This allows me to maintain the 180-degree shutter rule and still shoot at 24 frames per second. Now, if you didn't have an ND filter, you could also just raise the aperture, but that just means that you're gonna have less of a blurry background. So the easiest thing to do is just get yourself a variable ND filter. You just wanna make sure that you get one that doesn't have a bunch of crazy color casts or anything that's gonna mess up the colors in your shot. So which frame rate should you use? Well, I say use all of them, and use all of them with the intent of editing them on a 24 frame per second timeline. So what you're doing is whenever you're going out and you're shooting, you're being intentional with shooting at higher frame rates because you know when you shoot at higher frame rates, what you're gonna be doing with that footage is slowing it down whenever you get it into the edit. So again, I shoot most of the stuff that I make in 24 frames per second, but I also try to make sure that I get some slow motion shots whenever I'm out there on location as well, just to have some variety in my shots. Feel free to play around and break these rules every now and then to explore your own creative interest. This is just a guide for getting a desired look. If you thought this was helpful and you know someone learning videography, please share this with them. And if you want to learn more about frame rates in the edit, watch this video next, and I'll see you in the next one.